The camera was rolling. The scene was a colonial drama set in Ceylon. Plantation society, peacocks on the lawn, the whole sweltering apparatus of empire. The woman standing in frame had 2 Academy Awards at home in London. She was one of the most recognizable faces on Earth, and Paramount Pictures had structured an entire production around her presence. Then she began to speak. The words weren't from Elephant Walk. They were from A Streetcar Named Desire. They were Blanche DuBois' lines, delivered in Blanche DuBois' register, coming out of an actress who no longer seemed entirely certain which character she was. Director William Dieterle called cut. The soundstage went quiet in the particular way that soundstages go quiet when something has gone wrong that no one has the language to name. That was the spring of 1953. Vivien Leigh was 39 years old. The machinery of one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood was already in motion around her, not to help, but to replace. This isn't a story about a woman destroyed by fame. It isn't a cautionary tale about the price of glamour. It's a story about a woman with a severe psychiatric illness who has failed, systematically and deliberately, by an industry that had no framework for her condition beyond what it cost them on the balance sheet. The studio system called her difficult. She was sick. Those aren't the same thing, and the people responsible for the distinction knew it and made a different calculation. Vivien Leigh won 2 Academy Awards, played 2 of the most psychologically complex women in the history of cinema, and spent the last 22 years of her life fighting a mental illness that her era couldn't treat, and a physical illness that eventually killed her. The institution that extracted the most from her was the first to turn its back. What she managed to produce anyway, what she refused to stop producing, is the other half of the story that the elegies tend to leave out. She was born Vivien Mary Hartley on November 5, 1913, in Darjeeling, India, to a British father named Ernest Hartley, who had spent much of his own life in the subcontinent. She was educated in European convent schools, Dinard, San Remo, Paris, Bavaria, returning to London in her early 20s with fluency in French and Italian, a convent-trained posture, and almost no patience for remaining a secondary character in anyone else's story. Her daughter Suzanne was born in October 1933. She returned to acting in 1934, adopted the stage name Vivien Leigh, and made her film debut with a one-line role in Things Are Looking Up. 5 years later, she was Scarlett O'Hara. The Academy Award for Best Actress arrived in 1939 for Gone with the Wind, and with it, the particular burden of having your most famous role become the public shorthand for your entire existence. When her daughter Suzanne gave birth years later, the papers announced it with the headline, "Scarlett O'Hara becomes a grandmother." Leigh had been alive, performing and evolving as an artist for decades by then. The culture had filed her under one character and mostly left her there. What the culture didn't file her under, because the culture had no interest in doing so, was a woman managing a serious psychiatric illness while working at the highest level of her profession without adequate medical support in an era when the condition she had wasn't even formally recognized as legitimate by the United States Congress. Her second Academy Award came in 1952 for A Streetcar Named Desire. It made her the first British woman to win the Best Actress Oscar for a leading role, a distinction that exceeded even Laurence Olivier's single acting Oscar, which he had received for Hamlet in 1948. 2 Oscars, 2 of the greatest performances in the American film canon, and behind both of them, a condition that the people closest to her recognized as catastrophic and the industry around her processed as inconvenience. The clinical name for what Vivien Leigh had was manic depression. The modern name is bipolar disorder, most likely bipolar 1, given the severity of her documented episodes. The distinction between the labels matters less than understanding what the condition was in practice during the decades she was living with it. Because the gap between what manic depression meant clinically in the 1940s and 1950s and what we now understand about bipolar disorder is wide enough that it constitutes a different medical universe. In the early 1950s, clinicians in the United States and Britain regularly confused manic depression with schizophrenia. A 1952 clinical observation noted that even a trace of schizophrenic features in a patient's presentation could destabilize a manic depressive diagnosis entirely, producing years of misdiagnosis, misapplied treatment, and the specific cruelty of a patient being managed for the wrong condition. The United States Congress, during this same period, formally refused to recognize manic depression as a legitimate illness. The stigma was embedded at the institutional level, not just in social attitudes, but in policy. Lithium, which is now the standard pharmacological stabilizer for bipolar disorder, wasn't yet in clinical use for psychiatric patients during Leigh's treatment years. There was no mood stabilizer available. The only medical tool the field had for severe manic depression was electroconvulsive therapy. And that is what was used on her. This matters because it means there was no gentler alternative being withheld. The psychiatric establishment was doing what it had. The horror of her treatment was the horror of a medical system working at the edge of its knowledge, on a woman whose condition it barely understood, with the one blunt instrument at its disposal. What the condition looked like, across the documented record, Laurence Olivier identified a recognizable cycle after years of direct observation, several days of hyperactivity and elevated mood, then a crash into depression, then an explosive breakdown, after which Leigh would have complete amnesia for the episode and would be acutely embarrassed and remorseful when told what had happened. That last detail, the amnesia and the remorse, is one of the most humanizing in her story, because it makes clear that she wasn't performing instability. She didn't know it was happening. She would be told, and she would be devastated. The documented symptoms across first-hand accounts include violent verbal outburst without visible provocation, physical aggression, hallucinations and delusional thinking in severe episodes, hypersexuality during manic phases, sustained insomnia lasting days, racing thoughts that made script learning impossible, and an unconscious preparatory ritual that those closest to her came to recognize as an early warning sign. Before a manic episode began, she would systematically remove all of her jewelry. Some part of her, beneath conscious awareness, was preparing. During manic phases, she had to be kept away from shops like Cartier and Asprey on Bond Street, because her compulsive buying extended to purchasing gifts for every cast and crew member she encountered. The shopping wasn't indulgence, it was a symptom. Her earliest episodes weren't identified as psychiatric events. A schoolmate from her convent years described Leigh occasionally withdrawing almost inside herself and becoming briefly agitated before snapping back to her usual cheerfulness, as though a switch had been thrown and then reset. In 1937, during a production of Hamlet with the Old Vic at Elsinore, she launched a verbal attack at Olivier without warning, and then returned to normal so rapidly that he told colleagues she had gone suddenly crazy. Nobody considered that this might be a clinical symptom rather than a character defect. It was filed under bad behavior. In 1939, during the extreme physical and psychological pressure of Gone with the Wind, an 18-month production during which she worked brutal hours, was thousands of miles from home, and was carrying the creative weight of the most anticipated film in years, Leigh took an overdose of sleeping pills. This was also not framed as a psychiatric event at the time. It was absorbed into the broader narrative of the film's difficulty. The pattern was there, across years and incidents. The vocabulary to describe it accurately wasn't available to the people around her, and the institutions those people worked for had no incentive to develop one. By 1945, things had become acute. During a stage run of The Skin of Our Teeth, she experienced what witnesses described as alternating attacks of hysteria and depression, severe enough to interrupt performances. Her friend and colleague Noel Coward noted in his diary years later that things had been bad and getting worse since 1948 or thereabouts. David Niven, whose relationship with language was somewhat less careful than Coward's, described her simply as quite mad. Those were the two registers available in the cultural conversation about women with Leigh's symptoms: clinical pity or casual dismissal. The industry needed a third option, medical accommodation, and didn't develop one. On October 12, 1949, Vivien Leigh opened at the Aldwych Theatre in London as Blanche DuBois. The production of A Streetcar Named Desire was directed by Laurence Olivier. The New York Times Review, published October 13th, described an audience that had queued for 24 hours before the doors opened. Tennessee Williams was among those who saw her perform. His assessment was recorded. Having known madness, she was well on her way to understanding Blanche. He wasn't speaking in the general sense of the word madness. He was making an observation about a specific person whose psychological reality he had observed closely enough to recognize. Blanche DuBois, as Williams wrote her, is in the final stages of disintegration. She is a woman who has survived a series of personal catastrophes: financial ruin, the loss of her family home, the death of her young husband, years of compulsive sexual behavior she can't fully account for, by constructing an elaborate internal narrative that keeps the most unbearable truths at a distance. She has delusions. She is hypersexual in ways she doesn't fully control. She can't cleanly separate reality from the stories she has built to survive it. She famously declares, "I don't want realism. I want magic." She is, in the play's final scene, taken away by a doctor she has never met on the kindness of strangers. She is institutionalized. Now compare those features to what is documented about Vivien Leigh's specific psychiatric presentation: hypersexuality during manic phases, delusional thinking during her most severe episodes, the difficulty in her final months before hospitalization distinguishing which character she was performing and which reality she was inhabiting, the eventual psychiatric institutionalization. The overlap isn't atmospheric, it's clinical. The character Williams wrote shared the same interior architecture as the actress who played her. Leigh didn't need to construct Blanche's psychology from scratch. She recognized it. The important technical point, which Where Madness Lies addresses directly, she wasn't using method acting. The Stanislavski tradition of deliberate psychological immersion wasn't her technique. The convergence between Blanche and Leigh wasn't a professional choice. It was an organic psychological resonance. The woman and the character reflecting the same fundamental structure, so that performing Blanche required no construction of an alien inner life. It required the continuous, exhausting maintenance of the thinnest possible membrane between Leigh's own condition and the character's. When the 1951 film version was being cast, producer Charles K. Feldman insisted on Leigh over Jessica Tandy, who had originated Blanche on Broadway. The reason was commercial. Leigh's name sold tickets in a way Tandy's didn't. The film was released September 19, 1951. What this means chronologically is that Leigh performed this role on the London stage beginning in October 1949, then reprised it for Elia Kazan's film, meaning she was inside this character essentially continuously across several years. The film won her the second Oscar in 1952. Marlon Brando, who had watched the filming from the inside as Stanley Kowalski, later said that Leigh was Blanche. Not played, was. Her co-star Kim Hunter described Leigh as terrified every single hour of every single day on the film set. Not the kind of professional anxiety that afflicts actors before first nights. A sustained, underlying terror. Years after the Streetcar productions, Leigh acknowledged that playing Blanche had tipped her into madness. Those are the words that appear in secondary biographical accounts of what she said, drawn from the Hollywood Reporter's excerpt of Truly Madly, one of the later biographies. The exact phrasing circulates in enough variant forms that the precise words resist direct verification against primary documents. But the substance of what she acknowledged is consistent. The role hadn't damaged her from the outside. It had found something that was already there. The membrane had been thin to begin with. 3 years of performing Blanche made it thinner. One biographer documented the studio's perspective on this with extraordinary candor. The film was made, no matter that Leigh's mental health was greatly stressed by it, and she won the Oscar. So she was a wreck, but she was ahead again. That sentence functions as an accidental confession. The film was made. She was ahead. The cost didn't enter the calculation. In February 1953, Vivien Leigh traveled to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, with co-stars Peter Finch and Dana Andrews to begin location filming on Elephant Walk for Paramount Pictures. She was 39, a double Oscar winner, fighting active tuberculosis, managing a psychiatric condition with no pharmaceutical treatment, and, as became documented during this period, conducting an affair with Peter Finch. She had been in Ceylon almost 2 months when the production began moving toward its Hollywood interior shoot. What the available records show about what happened in those weeks is a gradual accumulation of crisis that became suddenly, publicly, catastrophic. She was reportedly becoming increasingly unstable, mood swings that exceeded even what those around her were accustomed to managing. She couldn't retain her lines, not in the sense of an actor struggling with difficult dialogue, but in the more fundamental sense of the text simply not being accessible to her, and she was slipping into another character. During scenes for Elephant Walk, she was speaking Blanche DuBois' lines. Blanche, who had lived inside her for 3 consecutive years, was the character that remained when everything else became inaccessible. The accounts from the set describe her losing the boundary between Ruth Wiley, the character she was supposed to be playing, and the character that had, during years of immersion, become indistinguishable from her own psychological reality. Director William Dieterle had already begun his contingency planning. He was shooting her scenes twice, a version with Leigh fully visible in frame, and a second version with her either far enough in the background or with her back to camera, so that the footage could be used if another actress was inserted into close-ups. He also shot some scenes without her at all, specifically so those backgrounds could serve as process shots for whoever replaced her. This wasn't cruelty. Dieterle was a working director managing a production with a finite budget, and he was reading the set accurately. He had already concluded, based on what he was observing, that the production might not survive with Leigh in the lead. His contingency planning proved correct, and it's worth sitting with the specifics of what it represents. The physical machinery of Leigh's erasure was being constructed around her while she was still on set, still being asked to perform, still showing up every morning. By March 1953, the studio had made its decision. Paramount had an actress who couldn't complete scenes, a production that was falling behind, and a financial structure built around specific completion guarantees. Their response wasn't to ask whether a restructured schedule or a medical accommodation might allow filming to continue. It was to make a phone call. On March 20th, 1953, the New York Times ran the headline, "Miss Taylor takes Vivien Leigh role. Paramount borrows actress to replace Britain in Elephant Walk. Filmed in Ceylon." Paramount paid MGM $150,000 for the use of Elizabeth Taylor, a figure the trade press described as astronomical, and the studio press release characterized Leigh's departure as her quitting the picture because of an acute nervous breakdown. That framing was carefully chosen. Quitting placed the agency with Leigh. Acute nervous breakdown was a euphemism specific enough to explain her absence, vague enough to avoid the specific diagnostic language that carried the most stigma, and brief enough to discourage follow-up questions. Meanwhile, Laurence Olivier, who had flown to her side during the crisis, was telling the press it was tuberculosis and exhaustion. The same woman. Two simultaneous cover stories, the physical illness being deployed to conceal the psychiatric one, on the logic that tuberculosis came with social sympathy and manic depression came with something else entirely. Somebody had to deliver the studio's decision directly to Leigh. Paramount sent Peter Finch, the co-star she had been having an affair with in Ceylon. The person she had been closest to during the weeks leading to her collapse was the person dispatched to tell her she was out of a job. She was sedated for transport back to England. The sedative failed to work. She was accompanied by two attendants, described in contemporary accounts as wardens, for the entire journey. When she arrived in London, Olivier drove her to Nethern Hospital in Colesden, Surrey, and left her there. In her room at Nethern, a pile of telegrams and letters had already accumulated. She had not been told what any of them said. The Elephant Walk, that was released in 1954, starred Elizabeth Taylor. Taylor was quietly criticized by elements of the Hollywood press for taking the role, despite having had no hand whatsoever in the circumstances that created the vacancy. A detail that reveals something about how the industry processed its own decisions. The criticism landed on Taylor, not on Paramount. And if you watch the film carefully, in the long shots, particularly the Ceylon location footage shot in those months before the crisis became public, you can see Vivien Leigh. The production was too expensive to return to Sri Lanka for reshoots, so the location work she had completed remained in the final cut. She was removed from the film, but the camera had already preserved her. Her ghost moves through scenes she was fired from. The actress Paramount erased is still on screen in every print that exists, standing at the edge of the frame, impossible to fully replace. At Nethern Hospital, the treatment began. Electroconvulsive therapy had been used in the United Kingdom since 1939. By the early 1950s, it was the only medical tool available for severe bipolar disorder. There was no pharmaceutical alternative, no mood stabilizer, no other clinical option. Contemporary psychiatry was doing what it could with what it had, and what it had was ECT. In standard 1950s practice, ECT worked by passing electrical current through the brain bilaterally to induce a generalized seizure. The transition to using anesthesia and muscle relaxants with the procedure was still underway during this period. Historical documentation of British ECT practice indicates that most hospitals wouldn't routinely use anesthesia until the late 1950s at the earliest. Whether the specific treatments Leigh received at Nethern in 1953 used anesthesia isn't recorded in any publicly accessible document. The physical evidence of what the treatments did to her is. The ECT burnt her temples. It scorched her hair. She wore wigs afterward to cover the burn marks. Accounts from people who saw her on stage in the years following her first Netherny admission describe the electrical pad burns still visible on her forehead. The treatments didn't stop after her discharge. She received sessions at Netherny during her approximately 3-month first admission and continued ECT sporadically for the rest of her life until her death in 1967. That is 14 years of intermittent electroconvulsive therapy administered to a woman who was also fighting recurrent tuberculosis, appearing in theater and film productions, and trying to maintain some coherent sense of who she was. At Netherny during that first admission, ECT wasn't the only treatment. She was fed by tubes. She was induced into a coma. She received daily ice baths. She was, as one account drawn from a biographical source describes it, mummified in damp. a wet sheet restraint used as standard psychiatric practice in British asylums of the era. She was Vivien Leigh, the most famous British actress alive, the woman who had cued audiences around the block at the Aldwych Theatre, the woman Marlon Brando had described as inhabiting rather than performing her roles. She was also a patient in a Surrey asylum, who was being fed through tubes and wrapped in wet cloth because the year was 1953, and this was medicine. What ECT does to memory is documented in clinical literature that was actively contested even at the time. It causes retrograde amnesia, the erasure or disruption of memories formed before treatment, and anterograde amnesia, the impaired ability to form new memories afterward. One British Journal of Psychiatry paper on the experience of memory function after ECT describes the cumulative effect in terms that connect directly to identity. Aspects of our personality, since our memories are so critical to who we are affected. The debate between those who observed clinical stabilization from ECT and those who documented its psychological damage was alive in the clinical literature as early as the 1950s. Leigh wasn't a research subject in that debate. She was a patient, receiving the treatment while the debate was unresolved. Laurence Olivier wrote about seeing her after the treatments in his 1982 memoir, Confessions of an Actor. He wrote that she wasn't, now that she had been given the treatment, the same girl he had fallen in love with. That she had become more of a stranger to him than he could have imagined possible. Where Madness Lies frames it plainly. The treatments at Netherne had snatched the best parts of her. That phrase isn't sentimental exaggeration. The memory disruption produced by ECT doesn't only erase dates and names, it reorganizes the sense of continuous selfhood that memory maintains. The person who emerged from 3 months at Netherne was Vivien Leigh by legal name, by profession, by public identity. She was also a woman who had been through something that restructured her relationship to her own history, repeatedly, over years. Time magazine, reviewing Confessions of an Actor after its publication, noted that Olivier in conversation only hints at such a problem, blaming part of the trouble on Leigh's over-identification with one of her 2 Academy Award roles. The precision with which that phrasing avoids the word bipolar or manic depression is itself a document of the era. A man writing in 1982, still reaching for euphemism rather than diagnosis. Over-identification with a role was a more palatable framework than, "My wife had a serious psychiatric illness that neither of us had the language or the clinical support to manage." Laurence Olivier met Vivien Leigh while both were married to other people. They conducted an affair for several years while each was in a legal marriage, eventually divorcing their respective spouses to be together. They married in August 1940. What followed was what one biographer called the most closely watched theatrical partnership in British cultural life. 2 of the greatest performers of their generation, professionally interwoven, publicly inseparable, working together and living together, and being famous together for 20 years. He was also her primary caretaker for the better part of those 2 decades. He managed the episodes, recognized the warning signs, learned the cycle intimately. He knew about the jewelry. He had developed, through sheer accumulated experience, the ability to read the early behavioral shifts that preceded a breakdown. In his own writing, he described her as retaining her individual canniness even throughout her possession by that uncannily evil monster, manic depression, with its deadly, ever-tightening spirals. A phrase that contains both genuine grief and the specific vocabulary of a man who had watched the illness operate on someone he loved from the inside. He has been characterized in some biographical accounts as having ultimately abandoned her. Anne Edwards, who wrote a biography of Leigh, framed it directly. He didn't know how to deal with her mental illness, so he didn't. He focused on his work instead. That verdict has the advantage of clarity, but the disadvantage of flattening 15 years of documented caretaking into a single moral conclusion. The fuller picture is a man who managed something his era had no vocabulary for, no support structure for, and no treatment for beyond what was being done to her in the asylum, who stayed for a decade and a half before the emotional capacity ran out. His failure was real. It was also downstream of a larger and more systematic failure. The industry, the medical establishment, and the culture around both of them had nothing better to offer either of them than what Nethern was providing. By the time the marriage ended, Olivier was in a relationship with actress Joan Plowright. Leigh was aware of it. She had conducted her own affair with Peter Finch during Elephant Walk, a detail the biographical record confirms directly. The divorce proceedings began in May 1960 and were finalized on December 2, 1960. Olivier married Joan Plowright in January 1961. These events were public, documented, and treated by the press as the great romantic tragedy of the age, the breakup of the most famous theatrical marriage in British history. What was less public was that they kept writing. Letters found after both their deaths show Olivier, post-divorce, telling Leigh that she was weighing heavily in his heart, that he was only existing until he saw her again. Whatever the marriage had become by its end, whatever exhaustion and infidelity had done to it, there was something that persisted in the correspondence, something that defies the clean narrative of abandonment, without erasing the reality of what the abandonment had cost her. Tuberculosis has to be in this story, because it changes the story. Sometime during the production of Caesar and Cleopatra in the mid-1940s, sources place it at either 1944 or 1945, and the production straddled both years. Leigh was diagnosed with tuberculosis. During the same production period, she suffered a miscarriage after reportedly slipping on polished marble flooring on set while pregnant. The miscarriage precipitated a severe depressive episode, two serious medical conditions arriving simultaneously during a film production in which she was already exhausted. Tuberculosis treatment in the 1940s meant prolonged sanatorium stays, rest-cure regimens, and, from 1944 onward, streptomycin, the first antibiotic effective against the disease, which meant that early in her diagnosis, the primary intervention was bed rest and isolation. She fought the disease through the late 1940s and 1950s, while simultaneously fighting manic depression, making films, performing on stage, and maintaining the appearance of a woman for whom glamour was effortless. Alexander Walker, who wrote one of the standard biographies of her life, described her as consumed by devastating battles against tuberculosis, to which she finally succumbed, and manic depression. That sentence contains the whole shape of what she was carrying. When Olivier was managing the press during the Elephant Walk crisis in 1953, he characterized her collapse to reporters as tuberculosis and exhaustion. This was partly protective impulse and partly cold calculation. Tuberculosis was a medical condition that attracted public sympathy. It was physical, tangible, documentable, and carried no stigma. Manic depression attracted none of those responses. The illness being used to cover the other illness was a maneuver born of the exact stigma that made psychiatric conditions so difficult to treat openly in this era. The tuberculosis went into remission and returned periodically across the following years. It was managed, not cured. She worked through recurrences, adjusted productions around flare-ups, and continued performing. On July 8, 1967, Vivien Leigh died at age 53 in her London flat. The cause of death was a lung hemorrhage caused by a recurrence of tuberculosis, not her mental illness. The physical disease she had been fighting since the mid-1940s, the one Olivier had used as a cover story, the one that had run alongside the manic depression for 2 decades like a parallel track of attrition, that is what killed her. Her psychiatric condition had consumed enormous portions of her life, her marriage, her access to work, and her continuous sense of self. It didn't kill her. Getting that distinction right matters, because the alternative framing, the idea that she was ultimately destroyed by the tragedy of her own mind, erases everything she managed to do despite it. The studio system's relationship to mental illness wasn't complicated. It was simple. Mental illness was a liability category, placed alongside reputational scandals and box office failures in the same general ledger of things that cost money. Women in particular, who were already navigating an industry structured around their availability and compliance, were given a specific label when their behavior became difficult to manage. Difficult. Not ill. Difficult. Frances Farmer had been institutionalized in the 1940s after being deemed unmanageable, too headstrong, too willing to fight the system, too present in her own personhood to fit smoothly into the machinery that needed her to be an asset rather than an agent. Her career was effectively destroyed. Jean Tierney struggled with mental illness through the same decade and into the 1950s, eventually working anonymously in a dress shop near a mental health facility during treatment periods. Her star status suspended while she recovered from a condition the studio system had no mechanism to accommodate. What both cases have in common with Leigh's is the institutional response. Manage the publicity, protect the investment. Reclassify the person as a problem to be contained, rather than a human being requiring medical support. Studio contracts in this era contained morality clauses that gave studios broad latitude to terminate employment for behavioral violations. Mental illness, when it became visible enough to affect production schedules, was processed under these clauses as behavioral rather than medical. The distinction mattered practically. A behavioral problem could be disciplined or terminated. A medical problem might require accommodation, continued salary, or, in the most radical interpretation, actually treating the person. Studios consistently chose the former framework. Paramount's decision to replace Leigh with Elizabeth Taylor for $150,000 was framed internally as a business and insurance decision. But the business calculation and the psychiatric stigma were the same calculation. Her illness was a financial risk precisely because the culture had made mental illness shameful, which made it a publicity liability, which made it expensive. Leigh had been labeled difficult for years before Paramount made it formal. Contemporary accounts note that at the time, only those closest to her knew she had been diagnosed with manic depression. Everyone else was working from observable behavior. Sudden rages, extended silences, erratic moods, the specific texture of a person whose inner weather had no predictable pattern. The behavior was real. The interpretive framework was wrong. The gap between those two things is where her reputation was constructed, and where it was weaponized. Elizabeth Taylor, meanwhile, was quietly criticized by segments of the Hollywood press for accepting the role, as though the casting choice had been hers. The criticism found the wrong target, which was convenient for the studio that had initiated the replacement and had no interest in being accountable for the manner in which it had processed a psychiatric crisis as a contract problem. What Vivien Leigh did after Nethern was continue to work. This is the part of the story that tends to get compressed into a brief acknowledgement before the narrative returns to tragedy. And the compression is dishonest, because what she managed to produce in the 14 years between her Nethern admission and her death isn't a footnote. It's a career. Tennessee Williams wrote a novella called The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone, and when it was adapted into a film in 1961, he wanted Leigh. The man who had watched her perform Blanche at the Aldwych in 1949, who had observed closely enough to say that she had known madness before she found Blanche, trusted her with his material again 8 years after the Elephant Walk breakdown. He later described her performances in A Streetcar Named Desire and The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone as beautiful and delicately controlled. Williams had written two of the most psychologically demanding female roles in 20th century drama. He wasn't easily impressed, and he wasn't distributing charitable assessments. His continued professional regard for her work, after the breakdown, after Nethernen, after the divorce, after everything, is a precise counter to the narrative that her illness had consumed her capacity for craft. Ship of Fools, the Stanley Kramer production released in 1965, was among her final films. Between 1953 and 1967, she appeared in theater and film productions that required sustained professional discipline, memorizing text, sustaining characters across long runs, appearing in front of cameras and audiences, and delivering performances that critics reviewed and audiences attended. One biographical accounting places her career total at 19 films and nearly 40 stage productions. Some of those came before the worst years. A significant number came after. She wasn't destroyed. She was damaged, seriously and repeatedly, by the illness, by the ECT, by the marriage breaking under the weight of everything neither of them could manage, by an industry that had decided she was a liability before it had decided anything else about her. But she kept coming back to the work. The system that had replaced her with Elizabeth Taylor for $150,000 didn't succeed in erasing her. She appeared on stage with ECT burn marks visible on her forehead, covered in wigs where the treatments had scorched her hair, and delivered performances that people wrote reviews of. That isn't victimhood. That is refusal. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London holds Vivien Leigh's personal archive, her papers, her photographs, the correspondence that accumulated across 53 years of a life that was considerably more than its tragedy. The museum mounted a centenary exhibition of the archive, and scholars have continued returning to it in the years since. Where Madness Lies, published in 2024 and focused specifically on Leigh's post-1953 years, the period the biographical tradition tends to treat as aftermath, represents ongoing scholarly interest in a story that hasn't been fully told. Reframing Vivien Leigh, published in 2021, examines her working life and archival legacy from an explicitly reassessment-oriented perspective. The scholarly interest isn't nostalgic, it's corrective. The correction that matters most is the simplest one. She died of tuberculosis, not of manic depression, not of the tragedy of playing tragic women. The physical disease that she had been fighting since the mid-1940s, that Olivier had used to cover her psychiatric crisis in 1953, that ran alongside her bipolar disorder for 20 years as a second and parallel form of physical attrition, finally killed her on July 8, 1967. The mental illness shaped her life in ways that were devastating and real. It didn't end it. A bacteria did. The performances she gave are still on screen, and this matters in a specific way. Scarlett O'Hara is still on screen. Blanche DuBois is still on screen. The Blanche who Tennessee Williams said had known madness, who Marlon Brando said she was rather than played, who lived inside Leigh for years until the boundary dissolved. Those performances won't age out of the canon. They exist independently of every studio memo that classified their performer as a liability, independently of every press release that described her as quitting a film she had been fired from, independently of every occasion on which an industry decided that her illness was a problem to be managed, rather than a reality to be accommodated. The long shots of Elephant Walk still contain her image. Paramount paid $150,000 to replace her in that film, and she is still in it, standing in the middle distance, in the Ceylon footage they couldn't afford to reshoot, impossible to remove without returning to the location and starting over. The practical logic of cost management accidentally preserved the symbol. The woman they erased couldn't be fully erased because the camera had already been running. That isn't a metaphor. That is what happened. And it's, in the end, a more accurate summary of her legacy than anything the industry that processed her as a liability ever managed to produce about her. The studio system is what it always was. The films are extraordinary. She was too real for Hollywood, and Hollywood was never real enough for her. Subscribe for more stories like this.